Okay, let's jump right in. Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to unpack Dr. Robert A. Peterson's really fascinating analysis of D.A. Carson's work. Specifically, we're diving deep into the intricate arguments surrounding the origins, the mechanics, and the ultimate authority of the Christian scriptures. If you have ever wondered how ancient texts managed to maintain such a massive grip on the modern world, well, you are absolutely in the right place.
So, we're tackling a huge question today. How do scholars actually unpack that incredibly complex relationship between ancient history, divine inspiration, and modern interpretation? Because, it's not just about reading some old words on a page. It's really about understanding the foundation of how those words actually claim authority over reality itself. To make sense of a topic this dense, we've got a thematic roadmap for today. We'll start with early origins, then move to the nature of authorship, the role of genre, modern interpretation challenges, and finally, we'll wrap up with a comparative lens.
All right, Section 1, Early Origins. Was it unity or diversity? This is where the historical detective work really kicks off.
It's a massive scholarly clash. On one side, you've got the widely known Bauer thesis, which Bart Ehrman heavily popularizes today. This thesis basically argues that early Christianity was a chaotic, highly diverse mix of competing factions, and that a rigid, unified doctrine was only enforced centuries later by whoever happened to win the power struggle. But D.A. Carson argues the exact opposite. He points out that the historical evidence actually shows a substantial, shared theological vision came first, and the diverse heresies, they actually sprang up later from within that original unified vision.
So, what is the actual evidence for this early unity? Well, Carson backs this up by looking closely at the specific connections of the writers. The 4 New Testament Gospels have very discernible, traceable connections to the original apostles, the people who were literally closest to Jesus. But then, when you look at later, highly diverse documents, like the Gospel of Judas or the Gospel of Mary, they simply have no credible connections to those original apostolic eyewitnesses. Scholars track all of this through what's called the proto-orthodox trajectory. That's just a term for the specific line of early believers who actively preserved that unified apostolic tradition. Tracking that trajectory is exactly how scholars demonstrate that unity came before the diverse factions.
Okay, moving right along to Section 2, the nature of authorship. How does the concept of a text having both a divine and a human author actually work?
Now, a really common misconception here is that the Bible was simply dictated, like a boss dictating a memo to a mechanical secretary. But Carson clarifies that this is just a historical misunderstanding. When brilliant historical theologians like John Calvin used the Latin word for dictation, they were using it to describe the final, authoritative result of the text. They weren't talking about the mechanical process of its delivery. They fully insisted that the human authors contributed way beyond mere transcription, bringing their own unique experiences, vocabularies, and minds to the text, while the resulting words remained completely authoritative.
And within the text's own framework, that authority is absolute. The source notes that while God and his word aren't ontologically the exact same thing, the text repeatedly and strongly insists that they are tied together. Essentially, obeying or disobeying the word is treated as completely synonymous with obeying or disobeying God himself.
Which brings us nicely to Section 3, the role of genre. How do the actual literary styles within the text establish authority?
This brilliantly illustrates why genre is so crucial. The Bible isn't just one long, dry legal document. It's packed with ordering narratives, demanding laws, and rebuking prophecies. Scholar Barry Webb points out that these diverse genres work together to create an authority that engages with our humanity from the inside out. It's not an external coercive force of raw power. Instead, it's a gracious authority that recognizes human weakness and struggle. You see this unique engagement really clearly when you place Genesis right next to ancient Near Eastern myths. Sure, there are some superficial parallel similarities with things like the Babylonian Enuma Elish, but a careful study reveals massive, foundational differences in their worldviews, especially in how they view humanity's relationship with the divine. Let's move to Section 4, Interpretation and Modern Challenges. How do modern people interpret this ancient text today, especially when faced with science, philosophy, and everyday skepticism? To get into this, the source really hammers home the importance of epistemology. Now, epistemology is just the study of how we know what we think we know. Like, you can absolutely believe the moon is made of green cheese, but epistemology asks the critical question, is that belief actually justified? Is it warranted? When we study ancient scriptures, we have to ask those same hard questions about warranted belief. And that leads to a classic critique, right? Aren't the Bible's self-attesting claims just a viciously circular argument? Jesus points to the scriptures point to Jesus. Well, Carson responds that a certain degree of soft circularity is actually completely unavoidable anytime you're dealing with an ultimate authority. Think about it. If you use an external authority to validate a supreme authority, then who's really in charge? The external authority becomes the supreme one. You just end up in an infinite regression. Soft circularity is just the reality when you're dealing with ultimate claims.
It's really fascinating to see how this builds within the text itself. The internal relationship of the Bible is incredibly complex. The New Testament doesn't just copy and paste the Old Testament. It uses it in highly variegated ways. Sometimes, yes, it's a direct fulfillment of a specific prediction, but other times, it's a subtle linguistic echo or a sensus plenior, a fuller, deeper meaning of a previous idea, or even a typological connection. It's a deeply layered, interconnected literary web.
Today, how we read that web is definitely shifting. There's a big trend towards studying in interpretive communities. This is great because it helps combat isolated Western individualism by actively listening to the global diversity of Christians. It's a wonderful act of humility. But the source warns that we have to balance this realism with biblical warnings. Simply put, not all diverse interpretations are faithful or equally valid. We have to guard against false doctrine just as much as we guard against individual arrogance.
And that humility is absolutely crucial when science and the text seem to conflict. Carson advises that we must firmly distinguish between the final authority of the text itself and our favored human interpretation of it. History has shown us time and again that both scientific theories and human interpretations of Scripture are frequently revised. We shouldn't force an ancient Scripture to answer the very specific scientific questions of our modern day. Finally, let's step back for our fifth and final section, a comparative lens. How does this text compare when we place it alongside the holy books of other major world religions? You know, modern Western pluralism loves to claim that, deep down, all holy books basically say the exact same thing. But the source firmly argues this is simply not true. Claiming they're all the same completely papers over profound, mutually contradictory differences regarding the nature of God, the concept of grace, and human salvation. Honestly, it kind of shuts down serious, respectful conversation before it even starts. When you compare the Bible and the Quran side by side, the stark contrast is immediate. The Bible traces an arc of history through multiple human authors written in 3 different languages over about 1,500 years, utilizing all those diverse genres we talked about. By complete contrast, the Quran presents itself as the direct, unmediated words of God, dictated solely in Arabic to one man over just a 22-year period, largely formatted as direct exhortations. The very framework of how these books claim their authority is fundamentally different.
Ultimately, what's the big takeaway for the reader here? Rather than viewing the text as a confusing, rigid rulebook to be academically mastered, the source frames the clarity of these scriptures as a generous gift. As theologian Mark Thompson puts it, it's the gift of a gracious Father. It's intended not for us to master it, but rather to allow the text to master us.
So as you reflect on all of this analysis, ask yourself, how does diving this deep into the origins, the diverse genres, and the bold epistemological claims of these ancient texts change the way you view ultimate authority in our modern world? Does it challenge your assumptions about how truth is delivered? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I will see you next time.